want to take a step back. 4 years ago, we bought RCR Wireless News from Crane Communications and relaunched as a digital publication. And one of the first things that we did was sit down with Hugh Mina and separately with Steve Berry and ask what were the key issues facing CCA. And the message was clear. It was device availability, data roaming, and interoperability. And here we are 4 years later talking about the same three issues. So today's panel, we're going to talk a little bit about device availability, specifically some of the policy issues, technical issues, and standards issues that CCA members face in terms of getting device availability. So right now I'd like to have each of the speakers introduce themselves, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the interoperability issues that face device availability.
Okay. Jeff Pickett, I'm SVP of Sales for Huawei Device USA, and very happy to be here. It sounds like there's a lot of challenges, and we need to kind of work on some of these, so thanks for having us.
Thanks, guys. Josh Matthews, CEO of Apkudo. What Apkudo does is really helps small operators focus on device quality and ensure that the devices that they have sourced, unfortunately we don't yet help on the sourcing side, which is a much bigger problem than the problem that we solve. But once they have sourced devices, we ensure that they're of a significantly high quality to help you compete with the larger carriers and help you understand how best to position it to your consumer base in the context of your portfolio.
Good morning, everyone. Yasser Nafei from LG Electronics, and I had the growth markets for LG in North America, as well as I lead all engineering, quality, and customer operations. So really a pleasure to be here today with all of you, and hopefully we'll have a meaningful discussion, and we look forward for serving you and understanding how we can come to the challenge that you just mentioned throughout the last day and this morning as well.
Okay. So before we get started in the roundtable discussion, I'd like to maybe take a step back and walk you through the history of device availability. So if we could get the next slide. In the 1980s, we had the initial A and B cellular lotteries, and interoperability was an FCC mandate. In the 1990s, we had the PCS auctions, and because of the number of players involved in those auctions, you really had market-driven interoperability. In 2006, much the same with the AWS auctions, really market-driven interoperability. And then with the 700 megahertz auction, you really saw this division of policy and standards. And I'm going to flip to the next slide and pull up the band plan just to give, again, many people may be very familiar with this. We do have some folks on our live stream that may not be familiar with this. But what you're looking at is the 700 megahertz band plan, if you will. And what occurred was you had AT&T and Verizon end up establishing their own standard. So how did that happen, and how did the FCC miss it? And I think it caught a lot of the CCA members off guard, because the previous auctions, they really didn't have to think about interoperability. They just assumed it would be there. So when you look at this band plan, you had AT&T that ended up purchasing the B and C blocks and went to the 3GPP and effectively created a technical standard. Separately, Verizon, during the bid process, was bidding in that A, B, and C block, and Google, as I understand it, put a bid in for the C block, which cracked the reserve and opened it up, and Verizon switched their bidding to a different band. And with that, the C block, because they own the whole spectrum band, it created them the opportunity to effectively create their own standard. So you saw this division again of the what traditionally would be policy, and everyone assumed interoperability would be there, and then the standards being set. So you had this diversion of standards. I think with the recent AT&T agreement that addresses interoperability, I think the 600 megahertz and future auctions, because all eyes are on interoperability, I think it will work itself out. We hope it will. But I hope this helps everyone provide perspective before we jump into the roundtable discussion. Anybody have any comments from the panel about the band plan and some of the history?
You know, from a device standpoint, I guess I can say it's very complex. As you guys know, radios are not simple, and device guys always blame the network guys. You ever notice that? But it's really all of us kind of working together. And one of the things that I've kind of seen today that I think we all ought to do a better job is getting in front of some of the network capabilities and build them into the handsets. With the radios and the scale that's needed to produce some of these LTE handsets, it is a big challenge for the OEMs, to build the right device and to build it to meet your standards. And with the complexity of the auctions and the complexity of the number of bands, it's been a very big challenge for the OEMs. And we're just like you guys. We just make a lot smaller margins. But anyway, it's a difficult thing for us to figure out. But I think collaboratively we have to work closer together to find solutions that we can build into the handsets, offer scale, and even offer some bundling opportunities with maybe network equipment. And that's some of the things that I think that we're trying to achieve right now. But it is a major challenge for us.
Yeah, thanks, Jeff. Look, frankly, to be open, I really don't think that banding and interoperability is the #1 challenge in the broad and massive challenge of device availability for regional small operators. It certainly is a challenge, but to be open, I think the much bigger challenge is that I think it's fairly clear that the support in general from device manufacturers in the United States for regional small operators, I feel, is pretty disgraceful. I entered this market just 8 or 9 months ago, and I'm from Australia, so literally entered the market with absolutely no understanding of regional small operator space whatsoever. We've got 3 operators in Australia, and kind of our largest is as big as your smallest tier 2. But what I learned very quickly, and I was flabbergasted and shocked. You guys are having to bring in devices from Guatemala to get device availability. You've got distributors completely reflashing a brand new ROM on a device just to get simple things like settings and splash screens and preload applications working for RSOs. So while I think that's disgraceful, and while I think that the interop issue is certainly a big issue, I think the bottom line is you've got devices that work across these bands already. S3 is a good example, as released by a number of you, Cincinnati Bell, an example of one of the carriers that we work with a lot of you, but Cincinnati Bell is one of the example. No support from the manufacturer on those devices. Very difficult and complex challenges for a distributor to just get the devices working in the first place, just from a configuration perspective. So those are examples of where the interop issue doesn't exist. There's still a massive challenge to solve. So I think focusing on the interop issue these are definitely challenges to overcome. And I think that the recent agreement with the FCC and AT&T is around 700 is a good step. But solve that. It's already been solved in other areas, and there's still a massive problem. So that's kind of my perspective from an Australian who probably doesn't know what he's talking about.
Well, the word disgraceful, I think, is a very strong word to start with. But I would say that there are truly challenges that we need to speak about today that really, from an OEM perspective, are really challenging, and we need to work about it. And I think that there have been some allusion to some of those challenges, and we'll be happy throughout the discussion to highlight them. However, I see there is a lot of optimism, and part of the optimism is coming from how we build and design these devices. Today, as you know, we moved away from having these 3 inches and 4 inches to now the 5 and 5+. Having this real estate in the device allows you to have support for multiple bands and just give you more freedom as an engineer to be able to build a product. It's very easy for you and for everybody just to bring a product that is not certified to work in North America, and you bring it from Latin America or anywhere and try to make it work on the network. However, there are true issues when it comes to FCC regulations, SAR, quality, stuff like that. So this is the history, and we do not want to talk about it, but moving forward, I think the message is clear that all OEMs need to focus on the regional carriers and need to really invest in the customization of our devices to make it available. On the other end of the spectrum, and that's the purpose of the discussion today, is that from regional carriers, there is a duty and an obligation that you have to start working together on, as well as making your voices stronger and much well heard when it comes to this mess in the 700 megahertz. So I think that it's a collaboration, and including also the network piece of it and the variability that we see in the network piece. So I think that is the purpose why we're here, just to collaborate on this. On my end, there's a commitment to try to focus again on the space when it comes to devices. But we need to speak also about the challenges from a regular OEM perspective and supply chain and getting the volume that makes it financially and business feasible to build that network and have the devices for.
Do manufacturers not feel that small carriers have been fairly open about those issues for the past 4, 5, 6 years? I mean, I agree with you on the collaboration front, but I do feel that, at least from what I've seen, and I'm a big history aficionado, so I've spoken to a number of small operators that we work with and that we don't work with. Just what I've seen through the great work of organizations like the CCA, it seems to me that RSOs have been pretty damn open about the challenges that they face around us. So definitely agree that collaboration is necessary and certainly support that moving forward. But I think what it's really going to take is a commitment, particularly around configuration, a commitment from the manufacturers to solve that problem. It's not a difficult problem to solve. There are distributors out there that in a week can take one of your devices and reflash it with a ROM that does everything an operator needs to. The problem is that that's very risky, and it shouldn't be the case. And to a certain extent, I understand why you understand that one kind of broad perspective you might take is that you want to maintain some level of control over your device experience. And I've certainly heard that from some manufacturers. But I think what's happening is that by trying to obtain that control via not allowing the manufacturers to do these things, they're going to the operators to do these things. They're doing it anyway, and they're doing it in a way that completely has you lose all control of the device. Because when I put a new ROM on the device, I can do anything I want with it. The potential to impact the consumer experience, which is where we come in to help you on particularly those devices, is a big thing. Ensuring that they haven't damaged the consumer experience when they have to do that is huge. Whereas I feel that if manufacturers provided a simple tool to distributors that allowed configuration of a certain number of settings in a very straightforward manner that RSOs need to support their own brand awareness and work with you in partnership, which is, I guess, what I'm saying. You mentioned partnership between the small operators and yourselves. And I think together you can really work on kind of device brand awareness, and I think it's a phenomenal opportunity for manufacturers in the United States, particularly newer manufacturers or manufacturers with a large market share. But you need to support the bigger issues that they face that right now they're dealing with on their own.
A couple things that we need to kind of bring out. I mean, those tools are available now to actually set settings, flash screens, and help brand. We have those currently in our distributors, so those are all available. Those aren't the bigger issues. The bigger issues from an OEM standpoint are basically the business model to actually make the investment to build the LTE handset. And because LTE is a much more complex development process, it requires a lot more R&D investment. So it's not like the OEMs are not trying to build these handsets, but the problem is if the business model doesn't make sense for the OEM, that device is not going to get built. And what we need to do is roll up the volumes and have scale across the bands where we can build these devices. Because OEMs can't build a device if they don't have the scale to deliver it. So
I guess, yeah, I think that really creates a good segue into this next question is for the OEMs, and then Josh, we're going to come back and talk about some of the components and the technical requirements really to get to scale.
Sure.
And particularly, we're going to talk about some of as you move from hardware-based devices to software-based devices, what opportunities does that really create to get to scale? But first, I'd maybe like to ask LG and Huawei about their device roadmap that currently exists today for carriers to deploy who want to deploy 4G.
yeah, we definitely have a full roadmap of devices across really all the carriers in the U.S. and we're one of the largest manufacturers in the world, in the top 5. And unfortunately, the way that we look at any project and how we develop a device is it's based on a business model for that configuration and that specific project. And that's where some of the challenges come in the smaller areas where we don't have a larger scale of volume. It makes it very difficult to build 5,000 or 10,000 devices and build a complex device like we're talking about. We do have the capability to work with operators, and we actually would love to do that even more than we're doing currently. And there are some things that we can actually do to add value because we are more customized on our devices, that we can add a lot of things to Google and to the Android experience. And let's just face it, from a handset standpoint, we're the touch point to that consumer, and I think that we need to work a lot closer on developing these new services to be able to have the consumer have easy access to those services. And we work across multiple platforms. Besides Android, there's Windows 8. There's a lot of things that we can do as an OEM, but we need the collaboration with the carrier to make sure that we're ahead of these network challenges, because let's just face it, sometimes it takes 12 months to launch a handset and build a handset for you. So we have to be working quite a bit in advance to get those things accomplished.
Yasser?
Yeah, I mean, I think everyone in this room is we're all business people, and we certainly I think everyone understands the fundamental economic challenge that manufacturers face. I don't think anyone faults manufacturers at all from a model perspective, focusing on the tier ones. I mean, when you close a single deal and you get access to a consumer base that's 40 million in size, 60 million in size, I don't think anyone at all faults manufacturers for that. I think what RSOs want is, and they're happy to have some lag time, right? But those iconic devices, those devices that are launching on those tier ones, to be available to them as well. And that traditionally just hasn't been happening. The only way they've managed to get them is through these other channels, and we've spoken earlier about all the challenges that involves. So I think your point to the investment that it makes is in direct relation to the interop issue, and that's a good point. Is that if we needed to develop a device specific to a band where the volume of consumers accessible in that band is so small, then absolutely, and interop is definitely going to help there. But I guess a greater point is that there for devices where that hasn't been an issue, and for carriers where that hasn't been an issue, small carriers where that hasn't been an issue, we still haven't seen the full support of manufacturers in embracing them. So I guess that to me is the greater point. Is everyone understands the business model challenge? No one faults manufacturers for it. But I think what RSOs would love to see is kind of manufacturers embracing their needs a bit more, and just getting them access to those devices at some point in a way that actually works for them, and not a way that they need to go around manufacturers to do so.
Yes, so Yasser, let's come back to the roadmap and maybe talk a bit about.
So from a roadmap perspective, in general, like LG is the third world largest manufacturer. So normally we have products across the board. The issue is really not that. The issue is that it becomes easier when you have a product that works on a platform that is accepted by a lot of carriers at the same time. So as an example, we have started that with the iPhone franchise, as well as with the Galaxy franchise, and with LG now with the G2 franchise. When you have the phone going across multiple carriers at the same time, the Verizon, the AT&T, and we as an OEM, we benefit from the scale on one end. On the other end also, we become more experienced when it comes to putting so many bands in the phone, and becoming very experienced at how we can work on RF performance issues and data throughput issues and stuff like that. I talked previously also about the migration of the handset when it comes to size and how this helps as well. So from an LG perspective, we believe that it is a doable task. We believe it's becoming easier than before, because the specialization and the customization of handsets per specific carrier, and having 4 different versions of the same model does not help us. Today, we're seeing carriers accepting the non-exclusivity concept, and I think that Apple helped with that. Carriers now are accepting the fact that you can have the same model carried on at the AT&T and the Verizon and the Sprint. Maybe they don't like it, but it's becoming more and more mainstream than before. And we as OEM, we see this happening, we need to benefit from this. And I think that you need also, as regional carriers, to help with that, because once you quickly make your decisions about what type of phones you're looking for, and do not try to make a lot of differentiation from the mainstream, it helps you to get the devices on time. So we do not see the big lag that is happening today between getting the phone at Verizon, then getting it at a regional carrier 5 or 6 months after that, where it becomes almost end of life, obsolete. The thunder has erased. So I think that we're working together to try to bring that time of launching quickly, closer, just making sure that these global platform, I think, going to be a step in the right direction, and I think they're going to help us a lot.
I think that sounds great. The guys in the room here are sitting on band 12 spectrum and don't have devices. So can you maybe talk about what they need to do to get the attention? And I know it's not because they haven't tried with consortiums and such, but what's your roadmap and what do they have to do to really get your attention to create some band 12 devices?
Today we have band 12 devices. As you know, we all serve US Cellular, and US Cellular has band 12. So it is not unheard of. And also, I think that for the ACG group, it's normal to find devices that support pentaband. So there exist devices today that support multiple frequency bands from an LTE perspective, and it's doable. So it's not impossible to be done. The issue comes in when you add to the complexity now, having all the regional carriers, each one of them has their own network infrastructure provider. Each one of them is rolling a different type of technology when it comes, whether you talk about circuit switch fallback or you talk about SVLTE. So this adds to the complexity of it. I think from the collaboration we're talking about, it would be great, especially for those carriers rolling out their network at this moment in time as we speak, not to deviate too much. I know there is good reasons why they are cornered. We talk about the mess in the 700, but my recommendation is just like, let's not deviate too much from the way we deploy our network. I think that there has to be part of the CCA and other groups, some sort of a collaboration and advisory board on the lessons learned. What did operator A had issues with, and how did they circumvent that, and what can other operators B rolling LTE do the same? I think that is my advice, or that would be my input. That would make my life easier when it comes to having these devices. It's not far that we're going to see like hexaband, and we're going to see octaband, and we're going to see a lot of these in the devices. It's not impossible technologically. I think that it is the testing period it takes me to test on each one of those variability, and sending all my field engineers everywhere to try to check on the variabilities that delays the timing and makes it more cost prohibitive for me as an OEM. And as well, it reflects on you when it comes to not timely getting the devices, as well as now I become more concerned about getting minimum volume from you just to make the device from a business perspective work.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think there's challenges on the OEM side beyond the things that you mentioned. Just getting the radio bands together and not having the handset the size of this table is a challenge for us. These devices, whenever we start adding these radios, it actually changes our design platforms also. So those are things that we have to really look at. When we develop a very thin phone and we have to put all these radios into the device and have these multiple bands, it is a major challenge for us. One, it's a brand new piece of hardware. The other thing that we also struggle with is also to get the chipset manufacturers to follow your requirements and your band coverages. We're a Qualcomm manufacturer, so we definitely use Qualcomm in a lot of our handsets. Those are things that I would recommend from a CCA standpoint, that as you refine your requirements, that we get those to Qualcomm ahead of time too. Because those are challenges for us, even if we can't get a chipset in the right price band to actually build the device for you. So those are some of the other challenges that you didn't mention from an LG standpoint. But I think we share that sentiment that there's physical challenges too on the board and the design, and there's also challenges with the chipset support.
So Josh, Apkudo's expertise is really device teardown and testing and in emulating complex environments in the labs. Could you maybe talk about the specific handset components that are preventing interoperability?
Sure. Maybe I'd just like to touch on really quickly a great point you made around kind of furthering that aspect of collaboration. You talked about working groups with CCA and so forth. I think that's great. One thing I'd really encourage manufacturers to do in supporting and improving support for the regional small operators is to really tap into the ecosystem of the vibrant ecosystem of suppliers that are already out there supporting them. You made an interesting example of you don't have to send your field engineers out to every rural area that's covered here to ensure that that's working. What I'd encourage, and I think that's very much a mindset in kind of tier 1 upper level tier 2 thinking, what I'd really encourage there in terms of, in the spirit of the collaboration that you mentioned that manufacturers are looking to expand on, is tapping into that ecosystem of suppliers that can do that for you, and do it in a very open manner, so that we're all working together to serve the small operators effectively. So just wanted to touch on that point. But to your question, regarding device components and challenges around interoperability. I mean, look, it's Jeff and Yasser are completely correct. Bottom line is, it's just a factor from an engineering perspective. Getting radios across multiple bands into and the antenna design and all residual issues around that into handsets is an engineering challenge. Absolutely fundamental, an engineering challenge and a fact, and it will increase the cost of the handsets.
I want to be real specific. The antennas, as I understand it, can support multiple bands. The chip, the Snapdragon chip that's going into a lot of device, has the functionality to support multiple bands. So help me understand the specific components when you talk about radio or otherwise. What specific components are preventing interoperability?
So you make an alternative good point, which is from a chipset perspective and a general component supplier perspective, they already, and they've done a really good job, the past 5, 6, 7, 8 years of getting to the point of really supporting the manufacturers in that engineering effort. The biggest thing that we see from and I said engineering effort, and engineering spanning everything from design all the way up through to test. Our specific insight that we see with manufacturers is really around tests. So IoT testing, for example, is a huge overhead for a typical manufacturer, given requirements of particularly larger carriers, that expense and that engineering effort across that increases. It's a complex problem to get them working effectively together. But I think the good point that you make, and I'd love to hear from the manufacturers that are up here, around that chipset support from Qualcomm and from other component suppliers and in general. How much an influence do you feel that has on supporting you in overcoming some of these challenges?
Well, I think from a Qualcomm standpoint, I mean, we have a great deal of influence because we sell so many handsets through them. But the problem is, from that perspective, it's not only the chipset, but it's also tuning the antenna. The laws of physics kind of prevent some of these bands to work together. So the combinations are very difficult sometimes to tune the device to make it work. Sure, we can put all bands in, and if the RF's terrible, the device will not succeed for you guys. And that's the challenge, is we don't want to roll out a device that won't work across these band combinations. So those are things that the manufacturer also have to take. It's not just the components that are in the device, but it's how well that device works across those bands.
Sure. And I'm not a network engineer, and I'm a OS engineer, specifically an Android OS engineer. And when I see kind of challenges like that, I spoke about the configuration challenge earlier, and that's a really simple challenge to solve, and I know it is because I'm an OS engineer and an expert in Android. But not a network engineer. When it comes to that tuning aspect, this is going to be a really naive question. But is it not possible to have a process in place where single device, chipset supporting multiple bands, antenna supporting multiple bands, and tuning it to work across different carriers is a process that you do in place for sets of them individually?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's ways to add filters to make these things work. It just comes down to economics, and a lot of these things, anything's technically possible, but if the handset cost is above what the market will bear, then you have a challenge selling the device.
Sure. But what's the cost of the tuning part versus the cost of everything else?
That's information I'm probably not going to provide.
Oh, sure.
Let me try to just like comment.
That was my next question.
So,
but we're going to come back to it.
Yeah, but it's just like if you take a device, any device, the issue is not the chipset in my mind as easy as I think that it has been displayed. Let's look at the device. Today, the devices we're trying to put in place, there are multiple things going on. Number one, if you look at the camera is getting bigger and bigger than before, right? We moved from the 5 to the 8 to the 10 to the 13, 16, and there is a 41, right? Laws of physics again, that you need bigger surface. If you look at the display, today the displays, we work on something called bezel-less display. You can see that the display itself is extending almost to the edges of the device. If you take the real state of a device and you try to put all your 5 or 6 antennas, not talking about NFC, not talking about GPS, we're not talking about Wi-Fi, All of these things have the tendency to do interference, but the problem is the jamming. I don't have the space as it used to be in the past to go and try to put all of these devices. That's what I say, and I think that the future is not going to be about trying to make the devices slimmer and thinner and just like as small as it has to be in the past. I think we have proven as a community that we have moved beyond that. We have moved beyond really, and even today when you try to buy a phone with a 3.5-inch display, a lot of people don't even get it. So I think that the future of having bigger phones that has bigger real estate, as I say, going to help us with that. The challenge is really where to put those antennas from a components perspective, where you put your tuners, because the remaining pieces for me is just like I used to put them on the edges and have these line antennas. Now I don't have that. I used to put them on the top and in the bottom where I had the cameras, but the cameras are taking more space. So that is the technology challenge that we're seeing when it comes to components and how you tune them and how you place them. There is, of course, the cost of having all of these bands, as I say, NFC and Wi-Fi and GPS.
I think rather than dive deep into the cost issue, my observation is when handsets cost $600 and you're amortizing an incremental $25 or $35, or even for $100 more, when you look at the investments some of these rural carriers have made, C-Spire, for example, $190 million in LTE spectrum, and they're waiting 4 years for a device. If I were a business guy, I'd look at that and say, gee, if I amortize an incremental X dollars over $600 over the life of a customer, they might be willing to pay more. I can't speak on their behalf, but they've got business plans to look at, and the carrying cost of $190 million of spectrum and the risk of losing customers because your competitors are coming into your market and taking customers, that might be a path forward, which brings me to device financing. So let's kind of switch gears a little bit and talk about AT&T recently announced device leasing plans. I think the industry's kind of, following that path. What impact will similar leasing plans have on the overall device landscape?
Well, from my perspective, and I've watched, if you look at the laptop industry, and basically these devices now are very similar, with the processor speed and the type of capabilities we have. The higher the device gets, the easier that we can actually lower the cost of ownership, and financing is a good model. I've seen T-Mobile, kind of activate this model on their website. I think it's a very good model for all of us to look at because, again, as these devices get higher in price, more capabilities, more speed, people are going to want to have a way to easily pay for this device over a year period or 2-year period, even if they don't have a contract. So this could work either for prepaid or postpaid. I've seen it very successful with a couple of carriers, and there's some carriers in Europe that have done this over time. I think it's a very good thing that we ought to look at, and it may be an opportunity to partner with a nice financial institution and do some of these types of things. But as consumers want to get their hands on the latest, greatest, they're going to find ways to actually make it more affordable for everybody. We're also seeing this big shift from feature phones to smartphones. We got to have those types of programs in place. We also have to have simple UIs for people that are used to using feature phones so that the UI and the transition from that feature phone to a smartphone is a really easy transition for them. We also have to look at the other, the older adult segment, and I hope everybody's not laughing because I'm probably one of those guys. But anyway, if we look at that segment, they want simple ease of use, and they want access to the services quickly with the fewest number of clicks. And those are the kind of things that we actually need to kind of work on together so that we can add these new services in where it's easy for people to get there. So when we talk about financing, I think it's all about user experience and also reducing the cost of ownership for consumers.
Tremendously happy to hear you mention user experience because that's kind of the flag that we fly. Apkudo is a user experience and analysis company for Android devices. So I'll come back to that in a moment, but tremendously happy to hear that and we've seen these movements for the last 6 months or so with manufacturers focusing more on the device user experience rather than just rolling out the latest and greatest in specs. And I think that actually comes back to the point you made earlier around, if I can just segue for 1 second, around the device real estate, and you mentioned a good point about the camera. And it's a very good point. One thing that we've been encouraging, and some manufacturers are already doing this, is that specs does not equal a better experience. and you can ironically in the mobile ecosystem, given the constraints of an embedded device, and particularly the constraints around it being battery operated, oftentimes it's the case that lower specs and spending more of your time focusing on optimizing for that lower spec device around experience can achieve a net far greater experience than just throwing in a 41 megapixel camera. We're the guys that prove that 13 megapixels cameras that are out there are poorer in holistic user experience than even 5 megapixel cameras. So that's really happy to hear you say that. To the question about leasing programs, and I think what's also very relevant here is obviously the movements in the tier ones, both across leasing and in device upgrade programs. I think they're phenomenal kind of macro influences on the device landscape. I think it provides an opportunity for small manufacturers to move quickly to kind of meet and exceed what those larger carriers are offering there. And again, in this kind of spirit of collaboration between manufacturers and the already vibrant ecosystem of suppliers that are servicing the small operators, I think there's phenomenal opportunities there. From a pure landscape perspective, the influence that we're going to see on those things is twofold. I think you're going to see a trend towards fewer SKUs. This comes back to your experience point, and manufacturers focusing, and it's fantastic that they are focusing more on fewer SKUs and really investing in the device experience on those SKUs. So fewer SKUs, but a consumer expectation of re-upping on those devices much more frequently. And I think that creates wonderful opportunities here on a number of fronts, not least of which is what we're going to start seeing from the tier ones in terms of a large supply of refurbished devices coming much sooner into play in the ecosystem. I think that's one very specific opportunity. But just broadly, I think those influences on that landscape that are coming down from the larger carriers gives an opportunity to the smaller RSOs, and I actively encourage manufacturers and other suppliers in the ecosystem to really support them in taking advantage of that.
I would quickly comment and say, I think that point's well taken. Only one minor thing just to be aware of is that are we also opening a door for a secondary hand market thing? And has this been successful in the past in the US? And would that make its way into the US, or these devices will go somewhere else in the world? So I think the concept itself is beautiful. It makes sense. It offers great opportunities. I think we need to also look at the side effects that could be happening from there and take care of them.
Yeah, good point. But I think the interesting thing there is RSOs are already tapping into that secondary hand market because they can't get devices from anywhere else. So again, further to the point I made earlier around not kind of battling those trends and working with them and embracing them, I think it's a great opportunity for manufacturers to embrace what that is and support the smaller operators as they start to see an influx of devices. Much so. I mean, typically you get after sales devices 6, 8, 12 months. You're now going to see it much earlier in the picture, which is a huge advantage. And I'd love to see manufacturers kind of embrace and support that rather than try to battle against it, because it's going to happen anyway, and it's much better to happen with your support than not.
We're not fighting it. I think it makes perfect sense. Yep. We believe in it. I think just simply saying that let's study the overall ecosystem around it and just make sure that we are aware of it.
Okay, we got two quick questions I want to run by, and I'm going to start down the other end and work back this way. Yasser, when you look at intermediaries, what are your views on the CCA members really buying as a group? ACG's been around for a long time. What are your views of selling through intermediaries in volume?
I think that's the right way of doing it. I think that there is always advantage in the numbers. I think it also helps with unifying the requirements. Just make sure that you get access to devices at the right time, at the right opportunity. I think that would be a great step that we would welcome. Also reduces our interface to so many members and trying to customize different things to it. I think you're already doing that. I think we need to see more of it. And that would be very helpful. So I'm very positive on having something like that.
And Jeff, your thoughts?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think one of the things that helps us with scale testing and the ability to show our business case to build a device is to actually have a great forecast that's rolled up. because I can tell you our R&D guys are pretty tough and they have a pretty tight pencil. And when they look at our business case, it has to add up to them. And by having, the ability to have an intermediary, it helps us build that case. Because we as manufacturers fight inside our own company to try to get these devices. It's not that we don't want to build devices. It's just that we can't always win that business case. So, those are the things that we kind of need to do as an organization, I think, to help.
Okay. Just a really quick point about that. Agree with both of you that RSOs joining together from a volume perspective is fantastic. It's definitely the right move. I think the ACG is a great model for that. Love to see, again, sort of being a dead horse, but manufacturers, really support that as well. And it sounds like you are, and that's fantastic. I think there's an additional point there around what that opportunity is, and that is that there's not many of you in this room that are competing with each other. And I think we all know who you are competing against. I think what that gives you is an opportunity as part of that potential to join together, not just around kind of volume aggregation, but also around having a consistent roadmap across all of you, and getting support and buy-in from the manufacturers around that consistent roadmap. I don't see really too much of a compelling reason, apart from in some kind of niche cases where it really suits the needs of your specific communities. But I don't see too much of a compelling reason for there to be huge variation across the RSOs in terms of their roadmaps and the devices they're releasing. So I'd love to see small operators getting together and planning not just around volume aggregation, but also around just the general portfolio management process, and embracing the fact that you can have a consistent roadmap across all of you, and to great advantage for everybody.
Okay. We're going to wrap up with a question on the customer experience, and we're going to fast forward and assume that device availability is here. But before we do that, if you have questions in the audience, if you wouldn't mind raising your hand so that we can get a mic in your hands quickly. And then I'm going to, any questions? Let's get a mic in their hands. We're going to come to you in just a second, Russ, but why don't we talk about, let's assume for a minute that devices are here and tablets are here and they're all ready to go. Yasser, again, we'll start down there. Talk about that experience. What's the customer experience going to look like, and what impact will that have on the smaller carrier?
Very good. From my own perspective, again, I think that there is, so far we still have the business case for phones, and we still have the business case for tablets. I think that in the future, in 3-4 years, we're going to see some more of a convergence, if not earlier. Today, it's very annoying just to carry the phone, carry the tablet, carry the computer, and all of them have different type of screen size. And I think that there has to be a certain magic formula where we're going to get much more comfortable when it comes to mobility and carrying those devices, as well as the user experience, and be able to do more with these devices. And the roadmap of tablet and handset has proved that it is working actually as a good replacement for PCs, and we see that from the declining numbers of a lot of the PC deployment globally. I think that the tablet business is a great opportunity. I think, especially from a B2B perspective, I encourage the regional carriers to look at it really from a B2B perspective. All the applications when it comes to education, when it comes to healthcare, I think it builds the case for a lot of the tablets. The question is going to be, I know your preference is for LTE plus Wi-Fi. Is there a business case for Wi-Fi only? How can we merge those two such that, again, we do not fall into the trap of the bands, the spectrum, the interoperability, and all of these things. So I think that is an opportunity that would help tremendously when it comes to the regional carriers. So I think that is, in a short answer, I see future for both of them, but I'm seeing also conversion, especially when it comes to usability, practicality, as well as display size.
Jeff, any?
Yeah, I guess I'm going to take a little different approach. I think from a UI standpoint, one of the things that we all have to do is make these devices more usable for a consumer and easier to use, right? And we've done. You've seen variations of OEMs from Samsung to us, LG. We've all taken Google Android and made it simpler and added our own little flavors. Things like storage are going to be big, and having the capability to offer storage in the cloud and having access to these devices where it's a similar experience as a PC is some of the challenges that we're going to face. And I think those are things that we got to continue to evolve.
Now, how about impact on the smaller carrier, maybe their business model and their relationship with the customer? How will these LTE devices and handsets perhaps presents some new opportunities, and then we'll talk about the customer experience itself.
Well, I think, one of the things that needs to happen, the way you get stickiness for any device is to have the applications, the music, all the things in the device that make that customer really want to keep that device and use that device. And those are things that we need to continue to evolve and make easier for the users. I mean, you mentioned a very good point about multiple devices. You need to have that ability to use your music on all the devices, transfer it, pull it down from the cloud. Those are cool things that we're going to have to look at. We're looking at things around the home. How can you utilize your digital videos and show them on a big screen, or actually use the device to show on your TV? Those are some of the things that I think we all need to look at and evolve, and they're great opportunities for all of us.
I'd add to that, again, further to this idea of everyone collaborating, I think what we'd love to see is in order to do that, and completely agree that that's a phenomenal opportunity for everyone in the ecosystem, we'd love to see, in order to do that, manufacturers really embracing the incredibly vibrant and innovative application ecosystem that's on Android. I mean, you mentioned music as a good example. Frankly, consumers are already doing that today, and they're doing that through incredibly popular applications that are out there. And what I'd rather see, I'm not sure if that's what you're saying, it probably wasn't, so apologies, but what I'd rather see, rather than manufacturers trying to develop those solutions themselves, is to focus on innovation in hardware, which I think is phenomenal. And you mentioned your second point was a good one about connected homes and innovations can be done there. But focus on that innovation, and then on top of that, focus on getting that incredibly innovative and vibrant ecosystem of applications that consumers really want to use and already are using and are already going to get access to these services that they may on feature phones have traditionally only gotten through a manufacturer or carrier, and focus on improving the experience of those applications on that device rather than trying to do it yourself. So.
Why don't we move to a quick audience question?
Just a couple comments on a variety of things that you've touched on. We talked a little bit about the higher volume, the business models to get some of the regional service operators more devices, and I understand the challenge. As we start to see the ecosystem move down to, from days past, I'm with ACG, we used to launch 23 phones a year, easily. We're probably down to 7 to 8 now. We're moving to these global launch products, right? And Yasser, your point was, we're looking for millions in scale. And I think the challenge that we have here is the fact that it requires deeper R&D spending. You can't do the same R&D spending on a single device and expect to get to millions. We've already kind of played our hand with the spectrum auction. To Jeff's point, we have, millions in carrying costs to hold this fallow spectrum. And I guess what I'm looking for is some ingenuity. And I'm not trying to say that the OEMs are not ingenious. I think they've made huge strides, and Apple's had a huge impact on that. What I'm looking for is help to get us from A to B. Today, those business models that Huawei you mentioned, those are actually choosing winners and losers in the regional case. And if we can't help get new carriers launched to LTE, it's game over. We need to get to situations where if I look at, and it's probably a little lame to bring up the iPhone 5, but the iPhone 5 had hardware that was common among Verizon and Sprint and KDDI Japan. They had very significant scale, and when you activated the device, it chose to use certain components of that hardware and turn other components off, removing some of the challenges that you have with interference, and getting you that hyper-end, high-end scale. So I guess I'm asking, UI improvements are terrific and nice, but we're at blocking and tackling level. Yeah. We need devices that serve the spectrum that we have today. We realize it's challenging. So what can you do to help us get to the nirvana of VoLTE products? Because then we don't have to worry about all the fallback and a lot of the interference goes away. What can the manufacturing community to help bridge the gap from where we are today with LTE and a couple bands on this device and a couple bands on this device that don't necessarily serve our purposes to get us to that VoLTE only hexaband, even larger number of bands in a single device. I guess I'm very interested in hearing some feedback on that.
Sure. Let me try with that. I think that, as I said, there are technological barriers, but they are not impossible. We have pentabands phones that work right now. Apple proved it, others proved it. I don't think the issue, as I say, is really the technology bottleneck only. There is issues, but we have passed through that. We're talking now Penta, we've passed that. There is the Hexa, and we can do Octo, and we can do... I don't think, again, that technology is the barrier. I think we have a timing issue because there is the deployment time on the regional carriers for LTE is different between the different carriers. So, and as well as I said, the choice of the network infrastructure and UICC providers and stuff like that. So I'm seeing a timing issue because I would love to be able to get as much of these requirements when I'm announcing my roadmap and my new product. And the earliest I can get this lock-in when it comes to your own requirements, the easier I can put them in. Look at the Nexus 4 device that LG has launched last year. We incorporated all the APNs almost from everybody. And there have been others who came in later that we were able to put them in NMR. So it is not undoable. I think that it's simply timely getting those requirements from you and just putting them in there, I think going to help me build the case on one end because I would justify the volume. I'm not dealing with carrier A versus B and B is going to come back 6 months after. This is definitely going to help me. It definitely is going to reduce my testing time, and we talked about that and understanding that the challenges that we go just to certify the product to work on these variations. So you have my personal commitment. I lead engineering, and I lead the quality, and I lead sales. So I understand the need for it, and it is doable technically. I simply need, as we said, just to adjust the business case and the timing on that product roadmap. So what I owe you moving forward is to come back to you with the products that we announced for the Big Four in time for you to make that decision. What we would love to have is to get the feedback directionally, yes or no, and really which priority when it comes to these LTE bands or which frequencies you're going to see with these carriers ahead of the time, who are the 3 or 4 that are already ready, and who are the other ones that maybe come in an MR. That is really something I owe you, and it's doable, and I don't think it's impossible, and it's common business sense.
Yeah, I'm going to take a little bit different approach. I just want to be frank with everyone about R&D and how they look at things, right? And I agree with everything you're saying. We as OEMs need to kind of challenge our R&D the way they're building products. You know, when they build a product and they basically align it with a carrier spec, build it on a platform, it doesn't fit some of the other carriers, right? So one of the things that we are looking at is to see how we can actually build unlocked devices similar to what Apple's trying to do. So those are things that we're trying to work on. But I will tell you, from an R&D perspective, they don't change overnight. A lot of these platforms are 18 to 24 months. So to get them to change their whole overall thinking requires us to continue to pound the business case, the volumes, you know, the opportunity. Because let's just face it, guys, I mean, realistically, it's always about resources and allocating those resources with the best ROI. So those are the things that we have to do, and I continue to do that every day. And even though I'm on the sales side of the business, I push R&D and you know, I try to beat them with a stick. It doesn't always work, but we do our best to try to do that. And I think the more information, Russ, you can give and help us build our model, and the more that we can roll up volumes. And the other thing is, on the LTE side, it's a more complex device. If we can bundle with a 3G device and roll up the volumes even more, that enhances the business model for me to go back to my R&D team and say, look, here's what we're able to do. And those are things that we got to continue to try to drive. I can't tell you that I'm going to be able to change this overnight, but I will tell you that I continue to give these messages that you give me back to our team and try to really kind of formulate the change that we need to get you to devices.
Okay, so we are out of time. I think my closing comment would be, if you saw the Wall Street Journal this weekend, they talked about the lost generation, these 20 to 30-year-olds who can't get a job. I hope I don't come back here next year with the lost spectrum. I mean, this spectrum band that never was used, because we're kind of out of time. And I'll leave that, and we'll move on to Steve for closing comments. Let's give the panelists a big hand.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. Thank you for bringing your expertise. And thank you all to the round table, you know, Apkudo, LG, and Huawei. Very interesting comments. very encouraging from my point of view. And we know that devices are essential to everyone's future, and I hopefully you learned a few things as you plan your device strategy as we go forward. And rest assured that as you try to plan your device strategy, we're going to be continuing to work in Washington, D.C. on interoperability and data roaming and all those other policy issues that help make this possible for you. Now, the closing, I think everyone's sticking around for the two $500 winners that are sitting out there for sure. And then we have some things to say about our app winners. So it seems like we just got started here the other day, but I think we're coming to a close. I'd like to thank our Pinnacle sponsors again, Alcatel-Lucent, Ericsson, Interop Technologies, Cineverse, and TNS, before we go to the final round, the educational sessions. So if you haven't not done so, please take a minute to fill out the evaluation forms. You can fill them out there. There's a table right in the back. Give them the form and get your raffle ticket. And while you're doing that, I'll mention a couple other scheduling things. Let's see, the next show. The next show is our next CCA Global Expo. It's March 25th, March 28th in San Antonio, Texas. The events committee is already hard at work planning an outstanding series of events and speakers and sessions. As you know, it's our more technical show. So the expo is, we'll have a full exhibit hall also, plus San Antonio is a pretty nice town to be in the spring. So I hope you'll come and walk down the wireless technology Riverwalk that hopefully we're going to create there. So be sure to mark your calendars, March 25th, March 28th. And of course, we'll be returning here to the Cosmopolitan in Las Vegas in 2014. We'll have our annual convention. We will kick off Mobility Week in Vegas next year. We'll have a couple days at CCA, and our members and our vendors and suppliers will have to